Good evening, everyone. I hope that you are all keeping well. Delighted that you're joining us this evening for our burst of inspiration, which hopefully should be a burst of inspiration in the preparations for our special Shabbat. This Shabbat has a special name, everyone. Anyone know the name for it? The name for it is Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat of song. It's one of two songs in the Torah, and of course, it is the focal point and the high point of the parsha is when the Jews crossed the Reed Sea, the sea splits, and then they sing the song of the sea. But I want to focus on slightly earlier than that, just a few minutes earlier, and a moment that I don't think we've all necessarily given sufficient thought to. Good evening. I should say good evening to everyone. It's so rude of me. Sorry. Let me just say good evening firstly to Carol, our quizmaster as always. Good evening to Stan, to Joe, and to everyone else. I can't see everyone's names. I apologize. So we're going to make a start, okay? I'm actually also on tonight well, I'm not going to say what I'm on tonight, but I'm volunteering for something. So that's why straight after this, I have to zip off. Okay. So we have mentioned that we know that at the beginning, the highlight of the parsha is when the Jews crossed the sea. But we know there is a moment before that that is surprising, to put it mildly. Let's paint the picture. Let us understand what was going on, and then perhaps we can ask some questions, and then we'll come up with some answers with your assistance. Lovely to see you all this evening. So we know that the Jewish people left Egypt. This is the story so far. On the way, they thought to the promised land. That's what they hoped. 3 days they were in the clear. Then the Egyptians hear that the Jews seem to be heading back, and then all of a sudden they were pursued by the Egyptians, but led by Pharaoh. And by the seventh day, they find themselves, Pharaoh's caught up with them. So the Egyptians are heading towards them. The sea is behind them. They literally got their backs to the wall. There's no way out. Desert all around them. Sea on one side, Egyptians on the other. What do you do in such a situation? What do you do when you are facing a trauma, an ordeal in your life? Well, as Jews, we've always turned to God, turned to prayer, not as a last resort, but really it should be a first resort. Sorry, I must say a warm welcome from the other side beyond Woodside Park, Estelle Phillips, formerly of Woodside Park, who moved this week to Stanmore. Estelle, we welcome you, even though you are no longer physically in the Woodside Park area. We welcome you all the way from Stanmore. So, as Jews, prayer has always been something that's been sacrosanct, a first rather than a last resort. In fact, we know that King David himself said, what did he say, friends? Va'ani tefillati, I am my prayer. So prayer is always our means of connection and dialogue with God. And yet, there are occasions when we don't use prayer, either because we feel that we don't need prayer. Think about it. When do we pray? When do we not pray? So there are occasions where we feel, I've got what I need. I don't need God, right? Remember the story about the woman. The woman goes to Brent Cross in the good old days, and she's driving around looking for a space, circling. Joe, you're smiling. And all of a sudden she looks up to God and she says, please, God, give me a space. All I want is one space. No sooner has she said the prayer, and all of a sudden in front of her, the Volvo, or it could have been the Previa, the Toyota Previa, comes out the space, and she starts to drive in. And as she drives in, she says, thanks so much, God, but you know what? I managed to find a space without you. It's okay. So there are times where we feel that we don't need God because we're getting everything that we want, or there's times where we feel that our prayers aren't being heard. Those are the two emotions and thoughts that go through when maybe we don't turn to God in prayer, or we don't necessarily feel that there is any efficacy in our prayer. So let's try and understand when prayer is effective, when it is not effective. And more importantly, listen to this question. We're not going to shy away from questions tonight. What are you expected to do as Jews when your prayers go unanswered? You face a brick wall. What are you meant to do? And friends, I want to tell you something. The answer comes from a very Torah portion this week, a Kabbalistic idea we're going to share. We're going to learn Kabbalah, mystics. We're going to be floating in the air. It's going to be fantastic. So let's go on. Okay. So I want to start off by way of introduction to share a thought. We did just a warning. We will come down to earth afterwards, but we are going to get a bit mystical initially. So the Ishbitzer Rebbe, whoever came to Poland with us will remember that we visited Ishbitz. He was a 19th century great Hasidic master from the dynasty of the Ishbitz Radzin, and he described that there are three distinct dimensions that God operates in our lives. The first dimension, the Rebbe said, is where God is not known in the world. It's beyond our grasp. We have no relationship with God in certain areas. And then those are areas where we find that God is hidden from us. Then he says there is the second dimension where God's presence is palpable, it's manifest. We feel God is with us. And then there is the third area, right? Somewhere in between these two extreme dimensions. God's presence is sometimes manifest and other times it's hidden from us. In the area where God's presence is, we can't relate to God in this particular area. So therefore we wouldn't relate. That's an area that perhaps we don't pray. I'm not saying it's right, but that's just human nature. There is another area where we feel we don't need to pray. We feel that in a certain area or a certain person, he's got it without God. So he thinks, and therefore he doesn't pray. But there is an area where we feel that our prayers are being effective. And that is the area, the domain that we pray. And that is the area that sometimes we are answered, sometimes we feel that we are not. So we find that the idea of whether prayer is effective or not is the subject of a hot contention in this week's Torah portion. Let me explain. We already set the scene. The Jews have their backs, they're against the wall. The Egyptians are advancing. Within a few minutes, they are going to be slaughtered, right? Remember, God had delivered them from Egypt, redeemed them after 210 years of slavery. So therefore, the message that they had was that this was a God of mercy, of kindness, and yet now they seem to be left. What does Moshe do at this moment? Moshe goes on the mountain above the Jewish people and he starts to pray fervently to God. That's what we find in this week's Torah portion. What is God's response to Moses' fervent prayers, acting as the Chazan on behalf of the community, the Shliach Tzibur? He says, Moshe, Lama titzak elai? Why are you praying to me? Daber al bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel, v'yisa'u, and they shall advance. Now, this is absolutely perplexing, baffling, cryptic, if ever it was. Think about it. Estelle, Joe, Stan, wake up. It doesn't make any sense. We know that we already said, King David says he defined himself as I am my prayer. We should pray not only when things are bad, but when things are good. Thanksgiving prayers, appreciating God's kindnesses, but certainly when we need God's help, what do? We turn to God through prayer. And yet Moshe is being rebuked by God for turning to prayer at this particular moment when for us it may seem that never was there a greater need for Moses and for the Jewish people to pray. So there is a Talmudic statement that fills in the gaps. There is a clear vacuum here in terms of the narration. And it goes like this. Sorry, it's a Yalkut Ruveni, a Midrashic source. It says as follows, Hallelu Avdei Avodah Zorah, Hallelu Avdei Avodah Zorah. I'm going to translate. There was a debate, a dispute in heavens, in the heavenly realm, between the various celestial beings. The celestial guardian angel, if you want, of the Egyptians, says, why is it that you should God intervene here, save the Jews by drowning the Egyptians, right? Why should you intervene? At the end of the day, they're all as guilty as each other. They're all idolaters. We have to bear in mind there was merit for us to be redeemed. We know we maintained our Jewish identity, our names, our language, our dress, but we were a very rough diamond, excuse me, Joe, and therefore we needed a lot of polish that would take the next, well, a long time for the Jewish people to be polished. It started at Sinai and it continued. And therefore we also carried with us the idols and idolatry from Egypt. And therefore, God, looking down at us when Moses prayed, had to make a judgment call. It was a judgment. Are they worthy or are they not worthy of being saved based on the prayers of Moses? Now, prayer would not suffice here. Now, why wouldn't it suffice? And the answer is, simply speaking, because we were not in a position. We were as sinful in this regard as the Egyptians. And therefore, why should God save one nation? We're all his creations over the other nation, right? This was really the first existential threat, the first ordeal that the Jewish people as a nation experienced, an existential crisis, right? Imagine a child, okay? We don't need to imagine. We're living with our children that are, wherever we go, there are children at the moment in our home as we try to work and homeschool our kids all at the same time. So if we imagine a child that is always used to getting their own way, little baby, and then one day the mother turns to the child and says for the first time, no. The child is going to be shocked, dismayed. He's used to a certain behavior, used to getting their way. But the mother knows that it's called tough love. Sometimes you have to say no in order to educate, and so that child can go through a maturing process in its formative years. This was the position we as a nation found ourselves in as we were in our infancy when we left Egypt. And therefore, the key that God told the Jewish people when they asked through Moses to be saved was what? One word, ve'yisa'u, that they should move forward, move, advance. Don't stand still. Don't carry on praying because it's not going to help. And this point is highlighted by Rav Tzadok HaKohen, who was a student, one of the main students of the Ishbitzer Rebbe. And he said that when the Jews were commanded to move forwards, it didn't move forwards. It didn't just move. It didn't just mean moving forwards in physical terms. Yes, the Jewish people had to move into the sea, but it was also the mindset. In other words, there was a stalemate at the sea. The Jewish people and the Egyptians were considered on par in terms of their merit. The prayers of the Jewish people wouldn't help, because when you offer a prayer, what is a prayer? Well, a prayer is something that comes from a place of logic, of rationale. Think about the prayers that we say. We recognize first our needs, we process those needs, and then we express and share those needs with God. It comes from a place of logic. But if we are going to operate in a place of logic through prayer, then God in turn has to also respond quid pro quo through logic. And logic is based on judgment. Judgment is based on the merits of the case. The merits of our case when we stood on the banks of the sea was that we were no more worthy of being saved than the Egyptians. And therefore, God said, you're up, there's no way, forget it. There's no point in keep praying because I'm looking down and you and the Egyptians it's a draw, it's a stalemate in terms of you're both a nation of idolaters at this point in time. And therefore, God gave us the key at that moment in time as to how we were meant to advance and to go round the wall or over the wall if we came up against a brick wall in terms of prayer. What was it? Move forwards. Now, when we were told to move forwards, what does that mean? We've got to imagine the sea was in front of them. If in rational terms God could not save us, because in rational terms required a judgment of logic, therefore God was saying to us, you behave in an irrational way, and in kind I can then judge you purely out of love and in a irrational fashion. And that is precisely what occurred when they were by the sea. The Jewish people, it was demanded and asked of them to act in an uncharacteristic, irrational fashion. So to surrender their intellect, to surrender their ego, to surrender their perceived control to God. And by us, as it were, making complete self-sacrifice, giving ourselves over, relinquishing the reins of control of our lives and saying, God, I'm all yours. Do with me whatever you want, despite the fact that it made no sense since God had just saved us. So clearly he wanted us. We now demonstrated through jumping into the sea, the raging sea, that we were willing to give our lives for the very God that had just saved us from Egypt. We said, if that's what you want, God, we're prepared out of love and dedication to do so. And when God saw that we were prepared to act in an irrational fashion, illogical, then he was able to overlook the logic of judgment and to bestow his mercy on us purely out of irrational, out of the illogical context in which he would look at us now. And that, in essence, friends, is an absolute landmark in terms of the way that we are meant to behave, in terms of the way that we can conduct our lives. Let me explain what I mean. You see, we find ourselves very often that we are up against the wall. We find that we pray and then it doesn't work. What do we do when we find that we are praying and it doesn't work? Do you know what we do? We often give up. We say to ourselves, you know what? God's not there. He's not listening. What's the point in continuing? Forget it. When realistically, in reality, that is the time when we face a wall. What is being asked for us is to step outside the rationale and now demonstrate the unflinching love towards God. If we are able to make a bit of a self-sacrifice and to act in a rather uncharacteristic fashion, to go out of our comfort zone and do something that little bit more in terms of our actions rather than just our prayers, that is the time when God can say, you know what, really, you're not worthy. In the current situation, this is what you deserve. But since you have acted uncharacteristically irrational in terms of your devotion and love and demonstrated it to me, then quid pro quo, I have to do the same because it's a relationship. And that is what happens. It's a very important lesson for us all, especially when we find ourselves in the current situation. There are times where I look around and I say to myself, well, it doesn't seem right. Why is it I'm spending all day praying and certain people seem to be getting away and having the life of Riley? They've got wealth, they've got health, and they never pray, right? So there are two responses to that. The first is quite simple. We would rather always have the relationship with God rather than be cut off and not have the relationship. There are some people that don't want that relationship. And therefore God says, right, you want to be on your own? Here it is, here's your life. Live it on your own, but without any involvement of myself. You've got health, wealth, live it up here whilst you can. But there is the other answer, the other approach, which is what we've been saying tonight. Sometimes what God is asking is that when we have tried and tried again, and we see that in a certain area, a certain domain, prayer is not sufficing, then we have to say to ourselves, we thought that we know best. We thought that we understand what is best for us. Now, if we still want to try to get that, then what is expected and asked for us is to act in that uncharacteristic fashion, to let go. And it may feel like free fall, but in reality, we are in God's hands. You know that beautiful poem, I think it was, of the footsteps. What is it? I'm sure Joe, you'll remind us, or Estelle, where it's about God and the person is walking along the beach, and then they turn and they only see two footsteps in the sand, right? And they say, well, where God, when I was exhausted, when I was tired, there's only two footsteps. Where are you? And God says, when you were tired, when you're exhausted, I carried you. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. It's so easy for us to always point a finger and make demands and expectations. But really, what we need is to be able to have a look at ourselves and to say, okay, if it doesn't work in one way, then maybe I can reconfigure the way that I'm approaching this issue and demonstrate my commitment. Maybe may have greater faith, self-sacrifices, dedication, and maybe then, please God, we'll find that we are answered, but certainly we will reach a different level, different domain completely in terms of our level of spirituality by demonstrating that self-sacrifice in certain areas. And it can be little things as well as big things. It doesn't mean that you've got to go out there and lay down in the middle of a road and save someone. It doesn't mean that at all. It's the little things in life when we go out of our comfort zone. For everyone, it could be different. For some of us, it may be that phone call, speaking to somebody, giving them, being patient with people. There are all types of things that can make a world of difference and transform ourselves as well as those around us. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. We will miss you once again in Shul on this Shabbat. I can't believe Shabbat Shira, we're not going to be together and listening to the beautiful Baal Koreh. Usually it's Mark Reichenbach laning for us. It's not the same, but please God, we'll keep safe, we'll keep well, and we're looking forward to seeing everyone. I hope you enjoyed. I certainly have taken on board this new idea and insight from some of the great Hasidic masters and mystics. Is certainly something worth thinking about. Have a great night. All the very best.